All right. So tonight we were talking about moves to make before your trade deadline. If you don't have a trade deadline, congratulations. That's the right way to be. But this stuff will still apply to you, so hang around. Scott, if we have to make moves for a trade deadline, how do we do it? Strategy?
I mean, it's a loaded question because there's a lot of strategies based on, where you are in your league, when the trade deadline is. Is it Thanksgiving? Because if it is, you have essentially one more full week before you have to make a decision. If it's a lot of our leagues that I commish, we couldn't get trade deadline completely abolished. So we do like the trade deadline is right before the first fantasy playoff game. So you actually can trade past the last week of the regular season into the playoff week. You just can't wait until the playoffs start. Once that hits, then it's closed. Obviously, the later it is, the more time you have to kind of fish around to see, especially if you're like a third, fourth, fifth place team, do you really want to make the big move, or do you want to kind of say, all right, I'm already in the playoffs. I always talk a lot about trying to make the playoffs and embrace variance that happens week to week based on what schedules you have lined up with what combination of players. But the team, if you're going, all right, this team's a fraud, right? Like it might make the playoffs, but it has no chance to win. Whereas you might have others where you go, okay, maybe I've underperformed a little bit, but player for player, spot for spot, I'm just as good as some of the other teams. I just might have been fourth place or third place instead of first. So I think you have to look at that stuff too, because again, you can only trade. One mistake I see a lot of people make, and I made it myself last week. I gave up what I thought was going to be a very late first. So literally I had a 9-0 team, start 11. I traded my late first for Miles Sanders and Juju Smith-Schuster. Decent value. Like I'm getting two players for one, two players I could potentially start.
It'll start 11, right?
But then I look at my roster and I go, I didn't really upgrade anywhere. Part of what was driving my value of my team was the fact that I already had like 10 to 15 good players. So this really didn't upgrade. This might have been one of those spots where, and it's hard for me to do from a process standpoint, is add to another player my first and get a better player. Like Shane talks about. Shane's better at that than me. I'm sitting there going, man, I'm accumulating some extra value. And I know damn well I'm not reselling Juju Smith-Schuster or Miles Sanders for any more than I paid, right? Now,
Yep.
Juju's hurt. Miles Sanders isn't doing anything in this Monday night game. So I'm looking at like next week, I'm not going to get anything out of that trade. I wish I had that first back to maybe use closer to the trade deadline. So I think you see that. And basically my mistake there was it's a start 11. It's not a start 13 or a start 14. I essentially just bought myself more insurance on top of what I already had. And what I had was a 9-0 team that survived the loss of Jamar Chase, the bad play of Russell Wilson, and I'm still 9-0. So did I really need to add two like blah pieces, decent players, but not difference makers? Did I really need that? So I'm kind of kicking myself. So I think that's the other thing is you got to look, if you're going to start 9, I'm not one to give up picks for insurance in case two of my starters get hurt going into the playoffs. If the starters get hurt, they get hurt. Especially if you have a later trade deadline, week 13, week 14. Why are you making a move like I made in week 11 or in week 10? So I think that's one of the first things you got to look at. Is it even a league where I want to buy insurance? I assume if you're already in the playoffs, if you're like a hammer contender, unless you're buying a clear Austin Eckler, Derrick Henry, Tyreek Hill, someone like that where I'm really going for it and you're paying a pretty price for that, I'm still trying to push it out as long as possible, especially if I'm just buying like backup pieces, insurance pieces, especially if I'm giving up legit assets. If I'm throwing thirds around, maybe a late second, okay, that's different.
Right.
But if you're making that big move, I tend to be a little more conservative than others.
Yeah, I don't believe in being conservative. That's from that goes for my political leanings. That goes for my fantasy football. What can I tell you? I'm going balls to the wall, right? And I've had the discussion before too. Like, yes, the deadline does matter, and when you make moves, I guess in theory matters. Except that I want to win every week, and if there's something that I can do this week to help me do that, and obviously also improve my chances as a playoff team, I'm going to do that. I look at a team that if I'm in like 4th, 5th place, hey, good enough for me. It's time to add some assets to it. Now, I'm not blind to the fact that like if I look at points scored and I go, well, yeah, I'm in 4th place, but I've also underscored, or I've been outscored by every other team ahead of me by about 200 points. All right, maybe I'll just let this ride and see what happens as opposed to adding anything significant to it. I might make some minor moves, right? I might go, all right, well, here's a 2nd round pick. Here's a 3rd round. Let me get back Deontay Foreman and a 3rd round pick from someone. You know what I mean? I'll make little moves like that.
Yeah.
But I do like when you make the big moves, you always add a little piece to it too. So if like you are trading for T. Higgins from someone, right? And they have Dante Foreman, you get Dante Foreman too. Because honestly, they won't even care about him. That part of the deal won't even matter one little iota. It's just kind of a like, all right, I'm making you pay up for Higgins. Here's a free Dante Foreman. And meanwhile, you're like, all right, cool. Here's the top 10 running back for the rest of the year, assuming he doesn't get hurt. And does he have utility after this year? Probably not. But I'm not really worried about that part of the trade for after this year. T. Higgins is the piece I got for this year and for beyond. Whereas Dante Foreman's just a guy that I can roll out there. Game just came back. I'm going to try not to look over. Dante Foreman's a guy that, at least I know I can roll out there for the rest of this year to help me with this year. And then after he expires this year, fine. So when we talk about being conservative or going for it, you also have to take into account, well, do I have picks? How old is my roster? If I deplete my picks and I have an old roster, I have no outs, right? So usually when you trade for someone, it seems to me to be common sense, you should be shooting for wide receivers that are no older than 27 so that you do have a chance to resell them. Hopefully that year. A lot of leagues I play in don't even don't have any trade deadlines. And we will trade up until the championship game, literally the day before. And to me, that's personally, I love that because I can make big moves and know that, you know what, if this doesn't work out for me, there's going to be a resale market. It might be two people, but it's two people going for a title, and you can definitely get those people to pay up. Because I've been in that situation where I've gone, I'm in the title game. I want to win the title. I'll worry about next year, and I'll overpay for a 29-year-old Julio Jones because he can bring me a title this year. But in general, if you don't want to blow your load before the finals, you should look at your roster. Is it old? If it is, I probably don't want to send off all of my draft picks that I have upcoming because I'm not going to be able to rebuild in the next year or so.
Even if you're a strong contender, would you give a 24 first for DeAndre Hopkins if you wanted to ship?
See, that's where it's a tough one because if you lost like Cooper Kupp, we had this debate. If you lost Cooper Kupp, what's the best way to replace that?
Bummer.
And you could say, can I trade Cooper Kupp? But I think a lot of people's responses are what I could get for Cooper Kupp isn't worth trading him away. I'd rather overpay in like the Hopkins deal and give up a 24 first and keep Kupp because I think he's probably in like Hopkins' situation where he is now next year. But I think you can also argue Kupp could be really productive for another year or two. So instead of saying, all right, hey, I'm the first place team, I just lost Cooper Kupp. Who wants to give me a receiver? You're going to be getting offered Christian Kirk or, like Amari Cooper. Like you're going to be getting dog shit offers from people going, I'll give you a wide receiver free because they know they have you bent over a barrel, right? You have a guy that's out for the season. He's going to be 30 years old. You don't have any upward momentum now to sell that player because he's not helping anybody. So you're stuck with them. But I think most people would go, I'm not trading Cooper Kupp for Christian Kirk. I'd rather overpay to buy Tyler Lockett or DeAndre Hopkins, and I'll just worry about having two aging receivers next year. But I'm not giving up that potential positional advantage. I'd just rather buy a player cheaper. So I think if that's the case, that would be the only place I would overpay for. I saw someone give up a 23 second and third for Tyler Lockett. They weren't the Cup manager, but I think that's a similar type of move where it's like, really, you're paying 2 picks for Tyler Lockett? Dude hasn't been worth that in 3 years. Well, you're paying more than what the price has been for. You're acknowledging what you're paying. You're buying a dying asset. Same with Hopkins for a first. Like, do I really want to do that? No, but if I'm in that situation, I'd be okay with it.
But there's also a difference between a first and a second and a third, right? Obviously, like if I'm giving up, I'll give up a second and a third. I'll give up multiple seconds for many old people. Like DeAndre Hopkins, you can have several seconds for. Tyler Lockett, I'll give you 2 seconds for. There's a bunch of guys in that range. As soon as you're like, well, give me your first, I'm going to go, no, I'll just hold. Like I'm not giving up a 24 first for DeAndre Hopkins. I'll look down your roster and say, all right, well, who do you have that's 4 years younger, even if they're scoring 3-4 points less a game? That's where I'll kind of keep my wits about me and go, no, I'm not just going to sell out for a 30-year-old DeAndre Hopkins that's one more PED suspension away from, missing a year.
The only thing I'll say is put DeAndre Hopkins and Davante Adams side by side. There's no difference. There's there's no difference.
Yeah, I don't know that I'd give you a 24 first for Davante Adams at this point. So that's the one place.
Davante Adams is seen as like, I think most people would offer their Cooper Kupp and they would take Davante Adams right away.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I'm down Cup and there's another team in the league, it's like 4th place, and they're willing to give me Adams for Cup, you'd be like, I'm smashing that. I'll take Adams. I'll worry about having the guy that's 6 months older next summer. Yet you put Hopkins in that trade and people go, I don't know about that. Yet you look at Hopkins and Adams side by side. It's like, what's the difference?
Yeah,
it's
I mean,
like,
Hopkins is outscoring him in 4 games. Davante Adams, because
right.
he didn't use
They're both
drugs.
over 30. They're both stuck on offenses that could be better, but
you're definitely making a value judgment. Who do you think is going to last longer, and who do you think is a better player, right? Minus the 4-point difference, 0.4 difference in scoring this year, Davante Adams to me is the much better.
And historically, Hopkins is a better player.
Is he?
It's not a Hopkins versus Adams debate, but it's interesting. Clay brought that name up.
You want to see something funny right now?
Career, is it like identical?
It's literally identical. It's 17 points a game for both of them, which again, that's not the end all be all, because both of them have had different, peaks and valleys in their career, where Davante Adams was,
and they've changed teams both too.
You know what that shows you though is what you should be doing when you're going, wait a minute, why am I going to give up a first for Davante Adams? Can I go see if I can give up a couple seconds for Deandre Hopkins?
Exactly.
Can I go give up a couple seconds for Tyler Lockett, who's another old person that's performing well?
Amari Cooper, I think, is a
Amari Cooper. Yeah, is there another old person? Like, these are people, the type of players that you should buy with seconds. The first are for the youngins, the young, like, hey, I want to get CD Lamb off of you. I know your team sucks and you're in a rebuild, but wouldn't you rather have 2 firsts that you can work with? And 2 firsts is an overpay. 23 and a 24, but this is the time of the year when I go, I'm already overpaying for that young wide receiver.
I'm gonna Shane's a little caffeinated tonight, or it's because my Commanders are currently beating his Philadelphia Eagles right now. So whether or not you're a fan of the Eagles or Commanders, give us a little thumbs up if you don't mind. Hit that like button, helps out this little channel. Okay, but let me ask you a question here. What are some things you don't want to do? Like, if somebody's trading you a quote-unquote old guy, they get it. They know you're trying to contend. What do you not want to do? They're going to want young guys. Should you not be throwing in your, Jameson Williams plus a first for something? What do you not want to do to sever your, team of the future?
I think we've kind of hit on the magic formula right now in terms of how to make these deadline moves. This is what Dynasty has become. It's day trading, right? So how can I accumulate points as cheap as possible, as late as possible, based on when my trade deadline is? Now, obviously, if it's week 12 and your trade deadline is Thanksgiving Day, if you have a big move lined up where you're giving up Jameson Williams in a first and you're getting Stephon Diggs or Tyreek Hill or someone like that, like that's a different realm of where you're buying a difference maker. You already know what you're buying. You're buying, the most expensive meal at the restaurant. You already know it's probably not going to be worth what you're paying, but you go into it knowing like you're paying for the best. Yep. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But that's a different move. I think teams get way too focused on that type of move when reality is you might have one of those moves that you make across a couple of your teams. Not everyone. We might sit here and go, it's time for our contenders to get aggressive. But even us, we're not sitting out there going, not every one of our contenders are we going and trading 2-3 firsts for 2 players, that we're not always making that first plus Treylon Burks to go get Tyreek Hill type trade. Not in every league. Because there are some leagues where even if I'm in 2nd or 3rd place, I don't have the future capital to go, I'm going to take that risk. I'll just try to win with what I have. So I think that's the one thing is look at your team. I don't want to, Shane said CD Lamb, right? If I'm a really good player away, but I have no other picks except for my own 2 picks, do you really want to pay 2 years worth of dues and give up your only picks for the next 2 years to buy a wide receiver? And it's a receiver that is good, but it's not one where you're like guaranteed he's going to bring me the ship, because no player is guaranteed to bring you the ship. So I think that's the biggest mistake is I'm going for the title, but then I see what you have left after you went for the title. And you go back to some of Adico's data where it's like the most you can ever get to is like a 35% chance to win the championship. So if you're already at 30, why are you giving up all your future capital for one player to get yourself to 35%? I think that's the biggest mistake I see people think. They think they're going all for it and they gut everything. Then when it doesn't work out, that's the team that's trying to sell Tyreek Hill in March and wondering why nobody's giving him any offers and why you can't get a first plus. So I think you just have to be really calculated in terms of if you have a bunch of extra picks to throw around, be a little more liberal with it. But if you're dipping into your own picks, I don't like making that move.
Let's take it from the seller side, right? So you've got these buyers, they're aggressive. They want your players that are going to help them contend, win a championship. I know you want to hold the leverage and, try to hold them over the fire, but you also want those players off your team. So where do you draw the line? How are you playing as the seller?
I always look at players like the running back specifically. I look at like Deontay Foreman, Khalil Herbert before he blew his pointer, David Montgomery. All right, what's their value going to be in 4 months? You remember what it was like trying to trade Deontay Foreman in the summer, right? You remember what you got for him? Nothing. No one would offer you anything at all. And you go, but did you see what he just did? And he's the primary backup in Carolina. And he goes, I don't care. So that's where I try to draw the line. And I try to decide, all right, is it more worthwhile for me to get a couple thirds for this guy? Or is it more worthwhile for me to just hold him and put him in my pocket and try this again next year? Because if he's only worth a couple thirds to all the contenders in my league right now, when is he ever going to be worth more than that? If that's the best I can do, then I'll bite the bullet and make the trade. I think it's important when you're trading away players, you're not trading away your core assets. Like I've seen teams that go into rebuild and they're trading 26-year-old wide receivers, and you're like, what are you doing? Like that's a wide receiver too, like a legitimate wide receiver too, and you just sold them at like cost. You didn't even get any additional benefit out of it. You've got to kind of pick the players that you want to move, and then you have to basically just determine what is the market in your league. Is it 2/3? Is that the best you can do? Then fine. If it's 2/4, well, you know what? Maybe put it back in your pocket and go, we'll try this again next year with Deontay Foreman.
Would you give Deontay Foreman and a 23/3 for a 23/2?
Yes. It's the old school trading where I'll just add a later pick to a player to move up around. No, I don't know where that's going to exactly fall. It could only be 4 or 5 picks, right? But again, it's the psychological advantage of, well, it's a 2 instead of a 3. A 2 is more valuable when I'm trading it in the future. So
well, just to speak to that actual deal, think about it 6 months now, and you're at the 303 and you're trying to move up to the 209 and you're offering Deontay Foreman, you get laughed at.
Right.
So you have to think about it in that regard. But I also have to think about, like I traded Jamal Williams before a game this weekend and I got 2/3. And I think those thirds are going to be like a 305, 308. And someone in the league goes, oh, that's cheap for the way Jamal's been producing. And I'm like, yeah, it probably is. But I was also a team that's going for literally the 101, 102, 103.
Trying to
helps
get the points
me
off your team.
Yep. Helps me there. Gives me 2 extra assets. And quite frankly, he was a guy that I've had on the block for 3 or 4 weeks now, but nobody took him. So I already knew that was the market where, damn, I don't want to trade him for 2/3 because I know I'm helping this other team way cheaper than he probably should be helped. But it helps my roster. It helps where my team is, helps me get to the bottom a little quicker. And I also realized that might be the one offer I get for him.
Yeah.
That's a guy, he gets a high ankle sprain, you never get a thing for him again, and you're stuck with him in the offseason.
Scott, what about you? You are the seller. How are you trying to work that leverage and play it for your team?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm the seller, I have to look at where's there some extra intrinsic value for me to basically get some players off my roster and build in the direction that I have going for me right now. So I think there's a blind spot in terms of the way we're valuing high-end running backs now relative to these spot start / replacement value guys. And I think those are a lot of the players that people are interested in buying, because rarely have I seen somebody come and say, I'm willing to go overpay to get your Dalvin Cook or your Joe Mixon, or very rarely do people go and pay up with the legit draft capital to chase an older running back that just had a really good game, right? Like you don't see those moves quite often. You might be able to get like a first for those guys, but you're really not selling at a premium. Much more often are people coming and saying, hey, can I buy your Jeff Wilson for a 1/3? Because they've realized that it's much better to do what Shane was talking about a little earlier. Like, why can't I buy the cheap players that can give me the flex range production versus the super expensive guys that we've already seen are not guaranteed to really give you elite production? So why would I give up my first? Everyone's going to do what they can to avoid giving up those first or giving up those young players to get points. So I think we've probably found like a value gap to where if you're selling these Jamal Williams, Deontay Foreman, Jeff Wilson, those types, I think you can kind of push back on managers that are only willing to give you a couple thirds, unless you find the intrinsic value where it's like, hey, this really helps me to get these points off my roster. I'm going from the 103 to the 102 and I'm getting 2/3. And I know it's a league where I can collect these types for cheap next year's rookie draft. Okay. But if it's not that and someone's coming to you going, oh, Jeff Wilson, he's a bum, I'll give you a third for him. It's like you can kind of price enforce a little bit there because what the alternative is to that manager. He doesn't want to give up his first, especially if you look at his draft picks. All he has is his 24 first. That guy probably doesn't want to send his 24 first for, Josh Jacobs, right? He's trying to avoid that move. Yep. And he's trying to buy the spot start dirt cheap running back for the rest of the year for well less. So I think that's where you have to push back and say, listen, man, you want the points, you got to throw me something here too. And I'm willing to eat getting nothing versus just handing you the points that you want. I think that's where you have to draw the line.
Yeah, exactly. I know his name is Jeff Wilson, but he's scoring a lot of fantasy points right now, and that's what you want, right? So,
right.
Yeah,